Morning, everyone. Today we're talking about the position that the United States was in the late winter and early spring of 1917. Now, throughout the entire war, yes, the United States took a formal position of neutrality, but the American people themselves, a lot of times, were on very strongly in one camp or the other. Like, for example, the Irish were very strongly against the English, especially after the events of the Easter Uprising. The Germans who lived here in the United States were strongly against the British as well. And, and just, there are many different factors that were happening here in the United States. But while the United States was staying out of the war, actually American business prospered quite a bit. While they weren't willing to send men over to Europe to fight in the war, we were willing to send over munitions, guns, and whatever they needed over there. So there was a great boom in American industry during most of the beginning of the First World War, where there was one story of one guy saying that his father, before the war, who was a factory worker, brought home $7, $8 a week for his pay. During the war, because of the great increase, he was bringing home over $100 a week, which in 1914-15, that was an astronomical amount of money. And so there was actually a labor shortage. One, because there were no immigrants coming in from Europe to fill those jobs in the factories. And so what American businesses did, quite reluctantly, was they turned to the African-American population of their own country. And they began putting African-Americans in what we considered largely whites-only jobs. And so that's where they began getting in there and getting involved in those particular industries. And so, but there were a lot of people were torn on what to do about the situation. For example, like Wilson was determined to keep the United States out of the war. But you got former President Theodore Roosevelt, who was strongly for the position that the United States needed to get involved in it from day one. So it's safe to say if Roosevelt and not Wilson had won the election of 1912, you could pretty much bet your bottom dollar that the United States would have been involved in the war in 1914 and wouldn't have waited until later on. And so those are some of the factors that were happening in the United States. There was a great deal of stress, a great deal of duress of what was going on over on this particular side of the Atlantic at the time, because many people in this country did not even consider the thought of us getting involved in a European war. Most people were willing to consider the Kaiser and the Huns as Europe's problem. So it was really coming to a boiling point around the beginning of 1917. Many Americans were hearing about a Bolshevik revolution. Most Americans didn't even know what a Bolshevik was, which is a Russian word for majority, but that's a whole nother story that I covered in a different segment. So many factors building up to a boiling point that's going to be brought to a head in my next segment. More on that to come.